welcome to our first episode of the Sacred Stories podcast. I'm really pleased and excited to have Marg Rainbird and Dr. Mark Crosweller with me today. So I wanted to introduce you both and ask you a question at the same time. So Marg, I'll start with you. You've studied and practiced medicine for 40 years, and running concurrently with that was an abiding interest in human consciousness and the esoteric, as well as aspects of healing that weren't included in the Western medical model. Your explorations have led to psychological as well as shamanic studies, divinatory practice, and a cherished relationship with the labyrinth as a tool for growing and healing. And you've said that the greater the distance from your life as a doctor, the freer you feel in sharing some of those less sanctioned areas of interest and practice. So you are one of the most fascinating people I know, Marg, and I'm so pleased to have you as part of this conversation. But tell me what you thought when I first posed this idea of having a discussion around sacred stories.
I was excited by the idea. I think you and I recognise our ability to share these kinds of stories with each other, over coffee. I think we went about it in the same way that many people do, where we kind of felt out what kind of stories we could share, what kind of experiences the other person was open to. We've acknowledged for a long time that that's an aspect of our relationship that we both treasure. So yeah, I was excited to engage in this conversation with you and with Mark as well.
Yeah. Thank you. And Mark, you are a leader in resilience and ethical intelligence. You've got over 40 years experience in disaster management and national security. You've shaped national policies, advised government ministers and prime ministers, and led through crises from local to national significance. Your personal and professional experiences over 4 decades have taken you on a profound journey to understand human consciousness. And you've said that your journey has shown you that true leadership requires a deeply personal philosophy shaped by esoteric experiences to cultivate compassion, courage, wisdom, and resilience. So what came to mind for you when we talked about this topic of sacred stories?
About time we started talking about it, essentially. I think I've had the desire or the wish for some time now to take the chance or the opportunity or the risk of talking about something that people generally don't talk about, and particularly people who hold positions of authority or power in institutions or politically or otherwise, because of the sense of shame that's attached to the more esoteric notions of life. But honestly, Jordan, people kept saying to me after I shared some of my stories, particularly after the loss of my wife, and they're very esoteric and spiritual and metaphysical, and they'd say, well, let me tell you my story, but please don't tell anyone that I told you. And I found that really sad. I found that incredibly sad. There's so much wisdom and insight in the esoterics of life that are mysterious, that are mystical, but incredibly important and profound in terms of pathways to wisdom and understanding and learning. And we seem to be just ignoring them because we've got mindsets and frameworks in which we operate which just simply ignore, deny or disavow this part of our life, this part of our human experience. So when you said Marg was interested, I hadn't met Marg before, but we had a meeting at the Mines a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, wow, that's fantastic. There's people thinking about this. Let's liberate the conversation and see where we go.
Fantastic. And I love the idea that I have the two of you here because in my mind, as I may have told you before, you are my uncommon people. So I always love to find uncommon people, and you are two of those kind that are just hard to put in any category because your scope of capacity to understand different landscapes of being across both the logical and the sensible and the spiritual and the esoteric and the deeply profound is huge. And I love these conversations that we've had over the years because there's such richness in them. And I agree with you that richness is such a gift to each other, to ourselves and each other, having these conversations. Why wouldn't we want to be having the conversation? But I guess that's the topic for today. So, we've talked about the idea of a sacred story, but maybe we should spend a moment just trying to define what a sacred story is. I'll start with my own thinking. My personal opinion is that we don't just have one sacred story. There are many kinds of sacred stories, and we can have a different sacred story of ourselves and of our lives and things that have happened to us and for us. They can be a story that's related to our inner journey, to our experience with the spiritual, or it can be a part of our life journey in learning. So a sacred story could be connected to something that we've learnt and cherish. For me, one of the reasons that I was so interested in starting this podcast was having just finished writing my second book. And during the time of writing that book, I was very aware that for me, The process of writing that book was for me a sacred story. It was a chance for me to be immersed in a story that had meaning for me, that allowed me to touch the sacred and touch and really explore the ideas of what I thought it meant to commune and connect with the universe. So I loved being immersed in that sacred story because it made me feel like I was connecting to the meaning of life, really. So Marg, I'd like to hear from you. How would you define a sacred story? How many sacred stories can we have? How many are there out there?
I was thinking as you were speaking, and I've felt this ever since we raised this question with each other. I have a stronger sense of sacred experiences in my life rather than a specific sacred story. But for me, I guess if they have one container, it's healing. Like it's the pursuit of healing for myself and others that's taken me obviously into and through medicine, but off into lots of other directions as well. So yeah, we can possibly talk about it more, but I guess I'm able to engage more intimately with the question when I think about specific experiences that have felt sacred for me.
Do you be open to sharing one of your experiences that helped you dive into that sense of it being a sacred connection or story?
I was thinking about it as I was walking this morning, and I guess that's no coincidence because I realised that very often for me, they've been when I've been outside in nature. One in particular was a morning I was participating in a shamanic summer school down in Bermagui, and we were doing lots of processes as part of that training. But every morning I would rise before everybody else and go for a walk along the beach. And this one particular morning, I was walking along the beach at a time when the sea mist was coming up from the ocean. There was cloud around Gooliga, which is a sacred mountain to the local Aboriginal people that I could see off to the west from the beach. The lighthouse was still lighting up in the northern aspect and the sun started to rise. And I just jokingly said, okay guys, this is perfect, but it really would be completed by a pod of dolphins. And within moments, this pod of dolphins came swimming into the path of the rising sun, and I just thought, oh my God, call that whatever you like. It was just such a thrill. And so I walked with those dolphins as they swam south on the beach, and it moved me to the point of tears. So it's experiences like that where you're just caught up in the moment and something quite extraordinary happens that for me are what I would define as sacred experiences. I
have so many questions when I hear a story like that. So you've told me that story before. I don't know that Mark's heard it before, but I've heard it and I love it. But when I hear that story, I automatically go to thinking about how we co-create with the universe our experience of life. What is it that we're doing that is dynamic, that our connection to a flexible universe where we can participate in things actually happening around us. I'd be interested to know if those thoughts from other people are what might stop you from sharing that story more broadly, because we've talked about this idea that with some of the reasons for not talking about sacred stories is because we want to hold them close and they're personal and we want to protect them and keep the experience truthful to ourselves. So how do you feel about people poking into that experience and reinterpreting it in a way that they might see is interesting?
I wasn't even sure how to interpret it myself. I'm open to the fact that it may have just been pure coincidence, but the timing of it was impeccable. And so part of me was also thinking, my God, if I had any influence over this whatsoever, I'm just thrilled by that fact. I don't claim to know how, but in answer to the sentiment behind your question, it's not a story that I would share with anybody that I would mainly change how I told it, perhaps, depending on how receptive the audience seemed to the possibility that it was more than coincidence, even if I'm unsure of that myself. And there's another example from that time when I was down in Bermagui that I could also share later in our conversation, if you like. But yeah, there was a hesitancy there, and there always is, with something I think that feels precious to me, and I can't fully explain how it all unfolded. I am selective with who I share those stories with.
I often feel the same way, and I also feel selective about who I share that kind of a story with. But I also wonder sometimes if I'm being overly selective and if I need to be more generous with my expectations of people to be able to hold such a story. Mark, what do you think about these kinds of experiences?
I think first and foremost, they speak to your personal truth. I think personal truth is really important. Truth has many forms and shapes, many structures and frameworks. There's logical, empirical truth. There's evidentiary truth. There's personal truth. I think my interpretation, if I was bold to suggest, Marg, is that you were intuiting, you're tapping into energy, and I think that's a very felt thing. It's ineffable. It's hard to describe. You try and put it into words, and it loses part of its meaning or its effect. So when you become one with something, when the duality disappears and you become one with consciousness, one with your environment, one with the circumstances and the moment, things manifest in ways intuitively. But then you try and describe it, and it becomes a post-event analysis, and it's hard to communicate how you felt about that, how it made you feel. I think that's the difficulty with sacred story, is that people will try and interpret on one level because they're trying to listen to the words and the language, but it's very hard to get a sense of the experience. But what it can do is it can open up relatedness. So people who are intuitive, who are tuned in, or who are open, can say, well, actually, let me share my experience. And it's coming from a place of felt experience, not from a place of thought. So I think that would be one way of looking at it. And I think, to your point also, Marg, about who do we share it with, I think that's a really good question, because we do expose ourselves. We do become vulnerable when we talk about very personal truths, things that are true for us, which may not necessarily accord with the mainstream thinking of the logics of the world. So I think there's a sense of wisdom that turns up and says, well, am I going to expose myself here? Am I going to bring harm upon? The courage comes in, and I think sometimes to have the courage to speak regardless of the fear or the sense of vulnerability, again, opens up a pathway of relatedness. And people will say, well, more often than not, will say, let me tell you my story. Or it starts them to think about spiritual stories, spiritual experiences. I think that's what's missing in the world, is that we don't give people permission to even think about it. And unless there's advocacy for it and there's people prepared to turn up, show up and speak and describe it to the best of their ability, what they saw and how they felt about it, we're never going to get the story perpetuating further, or the ability to tell stories perpetuating further. It's interesting that in Indigenous cultures we wouldn't be having such a difficult conversation. It'd be a very natural conversation, and people would be sharing stories around a campfire or whatever, around sharing and interpret the world the way that Marg interpreted the world all the time. And it's of no surprise to them that they thought about the dolphins and the dolphins turned up. It's of no surprise whatsoever. But we try and rationalise it and explain it scientifically or methodologically, and unfortunately science isn't there yet. And some science is trying to get there, and it's in pretty impressive pathways to exploration and curiosity. And some science is arrogant. It says can't possibly happen and tries to rationalise it away within existing frames of reference and theories and frameworks. And I think that's unfortunate. I think science should be on the edge of curiosity, on the edge of knowledge. And some of it is, but much of it is not.
It's interesting what you say about Indigenous people, Mark, because that leads me into the second story that I was thinking about during that time frame. This was in the bush rather than down by the beach, but part of that same week down the south coast. And I was on my own in the bush. Can't remember if I was repeating a chant, and I suddenly got this intuition to lie down in a hollow log immediately behind me, which looked a lot like a canoe. And so I thought, oh well, there's no one around to see me looking like an idiot. So I lay down in the canoe and I'm chanting, and I suddenly got this image of these three Aboriginal women, and they were saying, look, this is all well and good, but feeling that you've got to starve yourself to get spiritual enlightenment's crap. So in the vision, we pulled up to a beach and they made pancakes on the fire, and they were chatting away, and they said to me, we are the custodians of your soul. We row you from lifetime to lifetime. And it was just such an extraordinary experience at the time. And then I found out years and years later that I have three actual Aboriginal grandmothers. So yeah, you're right. They probably would think nothing of the stories that we are hesitant to share, but it just felt like such a strong affirmation for me. It was already a very powerful experience, but to find out that these women were actually part of my ancestry was quite a profound experience.
The thing I picked up in your previous story, that and I picked it up in my own experience, and it seems to accord with my research as well, is that these experiences and stories are always principally about the alleviation of suffering, or, in other words, to be compassionate. They're always coming to the frame of reference about one of life's problems or difficulties or constraints or circumstances that are unpleasant, and it's alleviated through these experiences, through these stories, through these affirmations, through these esoteric, psychic or mystical or metaphysical experiences. The core of them is about the relief of suffering. It's about love, about compassion. It has a virtuous element to it. The very things that we say we want in society, the very things that we want as antithesis to what's happening with the strongman politics, for example, the very things that we need in our societies are there to be accessed, are there to be experienced. We talk ourselves out of them. My son is a psychic medium. Fascinating watching him work. I've watched him as a little boy develop his skills, and it's been a really tough journey for him, very confronting, particularly in terms of energy and insight. But inevitably, when he accesses the spiritual realm and he brings people through, it is always about love. Passion, alleviation of suffering, encouragement, forgiveness, all of those things. It's absolutely about that. And people would say, oh, he researches before he goes to the platform, or he looks up their names, or he gets the attendance list. I can promise you, he's my son. I know he doesn't do any of that. For the skeptics and the criticisms of the skeptics in terms of psychic ability and mediumship. And I've got a healthy skeptical mind. I've got a PhD, for goodness sake, and you have qualifications as well, Marg, in science or what have you. So we're not foolish people. So we have a healthy degree of skepticism and sensibility about us, but our minds are open enough to at least be curious about things that we don't understand, and to observe people who have these experiences and these skills and these attributes, and be non-judgmental about it and seek to understand further what's actually going on here. And then to see the human experience or the result of these interactions, and they're always about relief. Always about alleviation, always about connection and relationality. And I think it's fascinating to hold space with our minds with these things and to examine them further in that context, and not try and link them back to science, frameworks, theories, methods, evidence, data. Those things are useful, but they're as dry as.
They're safe, aren't they? They give us
They're safe. They're safe because they're kind of, it's a bit like the academic world. It's a bit of an echo chamber, really. In order to advance something academically, and I understand why we do this, we can't voice our own opinion. We've got to seek the opinions and the evidence and the validations of others in order to solidify what we believe to be true. But it's funny that the truth is still relative, because a new piece of science can come along and knock it out of the water. And we've seen that in the course of human history, where we really believe something to be true through scientific methods and evidence and so on and so forth, only to realise that it actually wasn't true at all, or wasn't true in part, or was only moderately true. So having an open mind and an open heart, and still being sceptical, but with a healthy sense of skepticism and open-mindedness and non-judgment, is the pathway into spiritual story and understanding what's the essence of a spiritual story. And I think it is always about love, compassion. It's about virtue. But how do you alleviate the sufferings of the world? Because on some level, energy understands that we suffer. Consciousness understands that we suffer. And it tries to help us in any way, shape or form that it can to alleviate that, to help us along the path.
So, Mark, I asked Marg if she had a sacred story that she could think of to share. Do you have a sacred story personally that you are exploring or has been profound to you of late?
Look, I do, Jordan. I'll try and be as succinct as I can. It relates to the passing of Carolyn and the continuation of consciousness, and my version of proof, if you like, or validation that is enough for me to satisfy the proposition that from belief to knowing. So it's gone from belief to knowledge. But it's a belief I've held for a long time, and knowledge I've held intrinsically for many years. It hasn't just turned up because Carolyn has been validated profoundly by her passing, and I have no doubt that she is a big part of the architecture of that experience. And it manifests in the context of four sequential dreams. So she passed away just on 2 years ago, and a couple of weeks after she passed away, she came to me in a dream, and she was lining up to do a training course. And if anyone knew Carolyn, that would be exactly what she would be doing, learning new skills. And she walks over, she breaks out of the line and walks over and says to me, "Did you get my messages?" And I go, "What messages?" She goes, "I've been sending you messages." I said, "Well, I'm not getting them." And the dream ends, I wake up and go, "Wow, that was profound." The next dream, we're back at home, and I get to hug her and kiss her and say goodbye before she dies, because I didn't get to do that when she passed. That was a very cathartic dream, very, very healing. And in the third dream, we're having a coffee, and she says, don't wallow in your growth. Like, get on with your life. Only she can say that. In the fourth dream, She's dancing with the spouse of an iconic figure. And this is really profound for me because I used to dream about the iconic figure, and I'd tell her, I'd wake up and say, so I'll tell you who it is in a minute. Oh, so-and-so was in my dream last night. And she'd say, wow. It's usually around a process of change or some sort of life event or whatever. I was trying to correlate it with my circumstances, but it would happen 3 or 4 times a year. So she's dancing with the spouse of this iconic figure in the dream. And I wake up and I go, wow, there's a message there. I don't quite get the... A couple of weeks after the dream, a friend reaches out who's a medium. And she says, how are you? And I say, look, good days, bad days, terrible days, really. She goes, you should talk to Louise. Louise is a friend of hers who's also a medium, and I don't know Louise from a virus. I've never met her before. And what I just explained to you, I had conveyed to nobody, so nobody could possibly know my dream state, and because I just hadn't told the soul. So I contact Louise. I speak to her a couple of days after speaking to my friend, and she brings Carolyn through. And Carolyn knows that she's not guessing, she's not asking questions, she's making statements. She knows I've slipped over and dislocated my shoulder walking the dog. She knows I finished the manuscript to my book. She knows I bought an apartment, or I'm about to buy an apartment in Noosa. There's a couple of other things she knew which I can't remember, I can't recall right now. But then she says, she's showing me that she's dancing with Prince Philip. Does that mean anything to you? And Prince Philip, is who she was dancing with in the dream. And the significance is I used to dream of the Queen. The Queen would be in my dream, and I'd wake up, it was really clear, like that she was in the same room as me. It was clearly a metaphor. I'm not saying it was actually the Queen. She wouldn't know me from a Burris Open, nor should she. But the metaphor of the image was very powerful. So she's dancing with Prince Philip in the dream, and the medium knows that. The medium gets shown that by Carolyn in the reading. It's as clear and as accurate as that. In subsequent readings, I've had a conversation with myself in the garage at the house about the spiderweb room. And I would say under my breath, well, sweetie, I don't have to do that anymore, because she used to insist I clean the spiderwebs off the house. So I have a reading with Louise, and she says, Carolyn's showing me spiderwebs. Does that mean anything to you? Idea. I mutter under my breath a couple of months later how dirty my car is and how disappointed Carolyn would be. I have a reading with Louise, and she goes, she's showing me a car washing sponge. Does that mean anything to you? How much more proof do we need? Yeah. Through personal experience and personal truth, the consciousness continues beyond physical death. I don't need any more than that. I've believed it for a long time. I've sought to validate by being sceptical and seek to validate through triangulated experience, and I now have it. For me, my personal truth is consciousness continues beyond physical death. It's unambiguous in my mind. What that looks like, where that is, I have no idea. I'm not going to say I know where that is and exactly what it looks like, but I can say it continues. It's enormously relieving, but also very exciting, because it fundamentally ruptures some long-held beliefs in society about life after death, and it starts to normalise the process. And it's not religious nor anti-religious, but it does take you into fields of inquiry which are fascinating.
I love that idea about normalising these conversations and these experiences. And one thing that's occurred to me in hearing both of your stories is this process of triangulation or confirmation through different experiences. You know, Marg, you found out many years later about your lineage, and Mark, you triangulated through different ways of getting confirmation through different people. What do you think is a technique that people can use to be able to sense into these experiences and then triangulate through some other form of information or source to help them feel more confident that they're not being, they're not crazy, they're not deluded, and that there are ways to validate these sensory experiences that we often don't feel like we've got the framework to understand?
The thing for me, it's to open your mind to being curious and not judgmental. And I took many years ago through a series of tragic experiences in my 30s, not as tragic as the passing of Carolyn, of course, in my 50s, but difficult nonetheless, that changed the premise of my thinking. From life happening to me to life happening for me, I realised that life was about a lesson. I sort of realised that suffering had a function, and adversity was a teacher. And I made those 3 fundamental shifts in my thinking in my 30s as a result of lived experience. And from that, the world opened up for me in terms of understanding the nature of mind and consciousness. And I'd pay attention to my dream state and be curious about it. Just curious, not trying to interpret directly, but just be curious. Why was that dream so vivid? Why did it feel as real as sitting in this room talking to you now? How is it that I can have an experience where I know I'm in a dream, and then I know in the dream that I fall asleep and have another one? To go into a deeper state of consciousness, how do I know in a dream that I have full sensory perception, and I can step through experiences with full sensory perception, knowing that does that mean? I have no idea, but it's interesting, and I just got curious about it. Then I started to see the threads. I started to understand that these things did have some meaning, but it's very personal to me. Carolyn introduces me to the notion of mediumship because she was interested in it. I went along to a mediumship with John Edward, actually, years ago, 15, 16 years ago. And out of an audience of about 500 people, I think there were 5 men in the room. So it's quite popular with women, but not popular with men at all, because men are pretty close off to this sort of thinking. But it introduced me to a different way of seeing the world, and I just got curious about it, Jordan, to be straight up about it. And I started reading about it, learning about it, and going along and listening and experiencing these things with an open mind. I wasn't always convinced. Sometimes I was far from convinced, but occasionally I'd come across someone who was very skillful, such as John Edward, and apply a rational, empirical, evidentiary, critical mind and go, he's not kidding. He's serious. He's accessing a level of consciousness that you cannot guess. You cannot get information from somewhere else. And I was open to that. And I think it's an ongoing journey for me. But curiosity, non-judgment, open-mindedness, open-heartedness, understanding what's this really all about. It's about love. It's about compassion. It's about reducing human suffering. It's about connectedness and relationality. When I realised it was about those things, science can still sit there and have a fiddle if it likes and have a bit of a look and try and justify, prove or disprove. And that's okay. I'm all right about that. But it doesn't alter my personal truth.
Mark, what do you think about how we move into these spaces with more comfort and practice? What is the practice of moving into the telling it and sharing of sacred stories and experiences?
I've been trying to work out where this interest started for me, and I honestly can't remember exactly how, when and why. At first I thought, like, I was travelling with a friend in England and in Europe in 1984. I'd done my internship and my residency and needed to get out of the hospital system for a while, and she and I bought our Ural passes and went travelling. And whilst we were in London, we saw an ad in the Time Out magazine for a psychic. So we both went to see the psychic, and the psychic said to me, I see you in a white coat looking down a microscope, but you're not happy with how that model describes the world. I hadn't told her anything about myself. And, you know, from there, I went on to do seminars like self-transformations and stuff like that. But I then remembered that I read Colin Wilson's book about the occult. I read some of Shirley MacLaine's books about her psychic experiences before I started that travel. So I truly don't know where, when and why it started for me. And it's possible even that growing up as a Catholic, I've rejected the Catholic Church's dogma. But I sometimes wonder whether being introduced as a child to the concept of guardian angels and some of the more benign and benevolent aspects and the metaphysical aspects of that religion possibly sowed a seed in me to be open to other things. But as far as validation goes, for me, sometimes it's simple things like experiences of synchronicity. So I will read something that I find interesting as a concept, and then literally the same day someone will mention it in a podcast that I'm listening to, like things, and that those two things are completely unrelated. It's not as if I've sought out novels and podcasts that have the same themes and stuff like that. So it'll be something obscure that keeps getting repeated that makes me just have this sense that there is an interconnecting thread to our experiences, even if we don't know exactly what it is. And I don't even know if that answers your question, but that for me is a level of validation that's got nothing to do with how I'm assessing something intellectually.
I often wonder if we miss some of the validation as well, because it's not on our radar. So we may experience something a number of different times, and it, like the universe is hinting and giving us little tips and tricks and nudges along the way. And I think half the time, because we're not attuned to these things, because we live in a logical mindset for so much of our day, there's so much that's coming to us that just hits us and then falls away because we're not adept or skilled at interpreting the experiences. So I wonder if, more experience at connecting the dots will help us move into this space of the sacred more comfortably. But that's probably an ongoing conversation anyway.
And one of the other things, while I remember that's validating for me is other people sharing their stories, like people that I consider to be credible, grounded humans who are willing to share their experiences of what I'm going to call metaphysical right now, for want of a better word. I find that encouraging and enlivening, and that's a source of validation for me as well.
Yes.
It's interesting, Jordan, you talk about, and Mark, you talk about this overload of stuff. There's an acronym apparently amongst the younger generation called TMI, too much information. I've only recently, I'm a Luddite when it comes to technology, but I only recently signed up to Facebook, and I did it accidentally anyway. And I sort of looked on Facebook, and it is completely overwhelming with, quite frankly, a lot of nonsense and things that simply are not true. Not true in science, not true in philosophy, not true in lived experience, but it's there anyway. And I can understand why people get overwhelmed really quickly, because the flow of information technologically in society is completely overwhelming, and there's no time nor room nor space to think about esoterics. And until we get back to walking in the forest, as Mark said, and tapping into nature and the intuitive aspects of nature and the intuitive aspects of the nature of ourselves, we're probably not going to discover these sacred stories and the esoterics that come with it, and the lessons and the insights and the learnings and the instructions that flow from having these experiences. So advocating for sacred spaces, sacred places where you do put down the phone, you do put down the technology, you do put down your fixed opinions, your fixed views of the world, and open your mind up to what is consciousness, what are you curious about, what questions do you have in your mind that remain unanswered, that are existential, and sit with them. Just sit with them. Don't seek an answer necessarily. Just hold the question. See what turns up. That's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. It can be really frustrating. It's, I want the answer.
Yes, exactly. I think
Not going to come when I want it, but it comes. It turns up. People would say my 3 propositions in my 30s about suffering as a function, adversity as a teacher, life happens for us. How does that work with the passing of Caroline? And I say, quite simply, it's an unfolding process.
yes.
Starting to reveal itself. It's showing that it's on my path. It's the most painful thing I've been through. I can't begin to describe the agony of losing the person I love more than anyone else in the world. The grief is extraordinary, but the insight is there as well. I'll talk about it, write about it as time goes on. It's still very raw and fresh in my experience, but it's manifesting. It's showing itself. The dream states, the education, the insight, the profound understanding of consciousness beyond physical death. That comes from the experience of her passing. There's something there to share with somebody else. A friend of mine rang me the other day and lost his son in tragic circumstances and wanted to talk about it, wanted to talk about the grieving process, and I'm 2 years ahead of him. And I was able to give him some insights about my own experiences, which accorded with his, which kind of convinced him he wasn't mad. These things were okay to have these experiences. It was okay to think a certain way. It's okay to interpret a certain way. He's a scientist. He said, this just doesn't fit with my... He said, it fits with my experience, it doesn't fit with my education. I said, go with your experience. Be curious about it, be open-hearted. Yes. And absolutely grieve. It wasn't a rational conversation. I wasn't trying to talk him in or out of anything, but I was trying to help him to understand and interpret what he was experiencing as time went on.
Yes, the ability to sit with things as they unfold, is something I think a lot of people struggle with, because it's not instant. We can't get the answer immediately. We have to be patient and let it take its course, which, I think it's a challenge for a lot of people. One thing I wanted to ask both of you before we finish up for today is just this idea that sacred storytelling is hard for a number of reasons, but there's this element of shame where we feel inhibited and we keep our sacred stories to ourselves, even though we know how valuable they are and how they help us validate our own stories and each other's. So, Mark, what do you think is part of that? What's the reason we feel shame or we seek to keep these stories to ourselves?
I think shame has a moral function. Shame keeps us on track morally. So we need shame in the human mind. So a sense of shame is a good thing, because it says, look, I'm walking down the road of harmfulness if I keep behaving this way or thinking this way or speaking this way. So we have moral conscience, and the universe is moral. I mean, consciousness has a morality to it. That's a big conversation. That's an extraordinarily big metaphysical conversation. Consciousness has a morality. We know what's right and wrong. We don't have to don't have to struggle too hard to work it out. Contextualising is more difficult, of course, but we have an innate sense of right and wrong. So shame has an important function. But when it gets weaponised, when people are shamed because it breaches people's personal belief system or understanding, the risk of sacred story is that people can become self-righteous, adamant, forthright, dogmatic, zealous, and that generates a reaction. because it's like an imposition of value. It's an imposition of morality. And I think that's where sometimes the sense of shame or the pushback comes from, because people get adamant about their perspective and their view of the world. I think we have to be discerning about sacred story and grounded in personal truth and relatedness, and accept that some people may not be able to relate to it, and that's okay. Near-death experience is really interesting to research, because people cross over and come back, and they interpret through their religiosity. So they say the experience is actually ineffable. They can't actually describe the experience. There's no language that can adequately describe what it is that they go through. But in order to describe it, they use the language of religion. So they use the iconic figures in their religious faith to describe what it is they saw as a spiritual being, for example. So they use the term God or Jesus or whatever. But that's not actually what they saw. But they can't describe what they saw, so they use their religious language in order to describe it. So we're limited by language. We should remain curious and open-minded, and not be dogmatic and zealous about our position in the world and our story. And then I think people can listen, can hear, and maybe relate on some level to what we're going through. But I think so. Shame turns up, I think, when people get overly keen, overly enthusiastic, or we're breaching norms. We're breaching scientific norms. I mean, in the academic world, science dominates. There's a lot of contestability about in relation to funding, research pathways, politics, power. All of those things play into the space of science, and something comes along and disrupts that, or attempts to disrupt it, or seek funding in order to explore further, and it's not going to get a look in at all, because the agenda is so clear, and the forces behind that agenda and the sense of power that sits behind that agenda is overwhelming. So what do? You shame the research.
Yes.
You discredit.
Yes.
I'll finish off on this point, Jordan, that our ethos, our morality, is a big part of our identity, big part of how we identify ourselves. And when people attack that, they do it out of a sense of power and control. And we shrink back. Brene Brown says, guilt says I've done something wrong or bad. Shame says I am bad. And that's the difference. That's the distinction between guilt and shame, that we think we're bad people if we're shamed because of what we had when we speak to our truth. Somehow we need to help people to give them permission and safe space, sacred space, in order to share. And the people who are sharing need to hold a mind of humility and a mind and an open mind, and a mind that's very grounded in their experience, understanding that not everyone may be able to relate, and not everybody may even believe, but it still speaks to your personal truth. So I think the way it's communicated is really.
Marg, how about you?
For me, the motivations feel more like a combination of protection of the precious, and also, as both a woman and a medical practitioner, fear of being perceived as crazy, quite frankly. Women have been locked up for centuries, on the basis of their intuitions. They've been put in mental asylums, and, you can't work and live in the medical system and not be feared of being put on that side of the fence. So I think they've been two powerful influences for me.
Thank you. Well, I think this is a wonderful first step to opening up the conversation into sacred stories. I really have loved hearing your perspectives on everything today. So I'm looking forward to our next chat. Thank you, Marg, and thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you both.